Sewing equipment, their name, uses, safety tips, and location. First off, we have our spools of thread. We use thread to form stitches. Safety notes, we need to keep spools wound up and secured on the end so they do not make big thread messes in the sewing kits, which is the location of our spools of thread. There is only one black and one white spool thread in each sewing kit that lives with each sewing machine. Bobbins hold the bottom thread of the sewing machine. They need to be kept wound up in the holder in their sewing kit as well, just like the thread spool. Once again, there's only one black one and one white one per sewing kit. Pins have a sharp end and a head, and they're used to hold fabric pieces together. Safety tips, they should be kept in the pin cushion so that the sharp point is in the cushion. And location is, it's also in your sewing kit. Hand sewing needles help you sew by hand. Tips and tricks for them: if you keep the thread less than arm's length long, you will avoid it tangling when you sew and thus frustration. Location, they could be found on the island or supply table areas when needed. Sewing machine needles. Their use is they push the thread through the fabric in the sewing machines. They have one flat side of the shank, the top part, that goes to the back of the sewing machine and needs to be make sure it's pushed all the way up into the sewing machine to prevent skip stitches or hitting parts of the machine and breaking. Location, spare sewing machine needles are found in the bobbin case box, which lives on the island. Marking tools, they're used to mark fabric. We have chalk rolling marking tools, used as lightly as possible and as little as possible. And never ever unscrew this end that pours out all the chalk. They can be found in a pencil box on the island. Seam rippers are used to take out unwanted stitches if we sew a mistake. Please note the point is very sharp, so be careful. If it has a lid or a sheath, keep the lid on when not in use. And never ever put into pin cushions as it will cut through the pin cushion. This curved spot is a little bit of a blade which allows you to cut the unwanted stitches. Location, there is one in every sewing kit. Scissors, just normal scissors, are used for cutting paper. If you have to transport them, carry them by the blade so you don't accidentally stab yourself or others. And location, they'll be pulled out to the island supply area as needed. Fabric shears are used to cut fabric or thread only. These are different than normal scissors. They have a bent handle, which allows this part to glide across the table easier. Once again, if you have to carry and move them, I suggest holding them by the blades so you don't stab yourself or anybody else. Once again, only use on fabric, and be careful they are sharp. There is one in each sewing kit, and they are numbered right here, engraved to match every single sewing kit. You need to make sure you have your engraved pair. Pinking shears are fabric shears that have a zigzag edge, which cuts a zigzag pattern, which can help prevent the edge of fabric from fraying or falling apart. Once again, please only carry by the blade and only use on fabric. As needed, pinking shears will be pulled out to the island or supply area. Rotary cutters are used to cut fabric. They are a round pizza cutter style blade that has a safety. This black part is the safety. It slides up and down. Please always have the safety on when you are not actively cutting with it. Keep your fingers away from the blade. Cut away from you only, no back and forth motions. Pay attention, and always use on a rotary mat with a ruler. Rotary cutters can be found on the island supply area as needed. Rotary mat. Its use is it prevents the counter or tabletop from getting cut by the rotary cutter and has lines that are a ruler to help you cut straight. Safety notes, always use under a rotary cutter. They are also found on the island supply area. The rotary ruler. Long, clear rulers with each square being an inch helps you cut straight lines with the rotary cutter. Please note the rotary cutters do not actually cut curves. They are basically only to be used for straight lines. Please keep your fingers on the ruler to avoid cutting them with the rotary cutter. They are also found on the island supply area. Seam gauge, a little metal ruler that measures 6 inches or smaller amounts of straight areas. Please note they're thin metal. They can bend, but they should not be bent purposefully as that ruins them. Location, there's one in every sewing kit. Tape measure. It's long and flexible and measures larger round areas. For example, body measurements so you know what pattern size of clothes to make. Safety notes. Please do not whip people with them. Location, also found on the island supply area as needed. Fabric scraps. These are small bits of leftover fabric that are used to practice sewing techniques. Please throw away any fabric scraps that can't be used again, as in they're smaller than about 4 inches. They can be found in a big blue bin labeled scrap bin under the side counter near the turn-in baskets. Iron. The iron's use is to press fabric into a specific shape, add specific wrinkles, or remove wrinkles. Safety notes. Right here is the heel, and it should always stand on the heel when not in use, as this metal part, the sole, is what gets hot and will burn through your iron board. Please use the lowest heat setting that works with your fabric and always with an ironing board. Location, they're on the counter by the sink. Ironing board. Protects against the heat damage from the iron. Safety notes, always use when ironing. Location, they are by the wall by the sink. Sewing machine. Stitches fabric together. Has lots of different stitch styles, but that is its main job. Keep your fingers away from the needle. It will sew through your needle and it will not stop. Pay attention to what you're doing so your fingers will not get near the needle. Check all settings before you start so that you'll have the best chance at sewing well. They are stored to the drawer to your left in the classroom. Serger. Serger cuts and stitches to finish the raw edge of fabric. Right here's a blade, so anything that hangs off over here will get cut off. Sergers have 4 threads, so they can wrap around the edge. Please note they have a higher horsepower, so you need to be careful to go slow. Please keep your fingers away from the knives and the 2 needles. There should be no pins used at sergers, as the blade will cut them, but it will ruin the blade. Leave a 4-inch thread chain tail hanging off the edge here, so that the machine doesn't come unthreaded. And pay attention so you don't accidentally sew your machine in half, or sew your project in half using the machine. Location. There are 3 on the side counter or in stations 33, 37, and 40 of the classroom. Embroidery machine. The embroidery machine adds cool decorative designs, like you can actually put dog or words on your fabric. This hoop part is where it sews and it moves back and forth on its own. Fingers need to be kept away from the needle and off of this left arm part as it moves and will mess up the machine. You must have Miss Smith's help to use the embroidery machine. There are 2 on the side counter by Miss Smith's desk. Sewing terms. Sewing vocabulary and techniques that will help you sew high quality projects. First is the right side of the fabric. The right side of the fabric is the pattern side of the fabric that you want to have showing when you're done sewing your project, oftentimes called the pretty side, as compared to the wrong side. The wrong side is the back side or the inside of the project, sometimes called the ugly side. When they print patterns on fabric, they literally use a printer, and it prints really nice on one side, but then the ink gets soaked into the fabric and is very pale on the back side. Whenever you sew, if you want to see the right side on the outside, you're going to sew with the 2 right sides touching, and we'll turn them right side out later. Back stitching is when you use the sewing machine to stitch 2 or 3 stitches backwards on the same line at the beginning or the end of a seam to secure the stitches. It effectively ties a knot. If you sew in the exact same spot twice, the thread will not be coming out. I like to start about here in my fabric, backstitch the edge, and then come forward all the way down to this edge, and then I backstitch back in Make sure it's less than 1/2 inch long. Grain line. This is a pattern symbol. This double arrow can be found on pattern pieces, and it explains how that pattern piece should be lined up on the fabric, which direction it should turn, etc. The grain line should always be exactly parallel to the selvage edge of the fabric. Parallel means it never crosses. Notches are another pattern symbol. There are these diamond-shaped symbols on the edge of a pattern that extend past where you would cut the fabric, and they're to help you match up two different pieces of pattern, or afterwards the two different cut pieces of fabric. For example, the front of your pant leg to match up with the back of your pant leg. Place on fold line is another pattern symbol. It is an arrow that is bent and indicates that this edge of the pattern that the arrow is pointing at must be placed exactly on a folded edge of fabric and never cut along that fold. If you look at the front of your t-shirt, there's not a seam that goes down the front. Their pattern was only half of a shirt, where they put that center on the fold and cut it out with it ending up being one piece across the front of your t-shirt. Seam and seam allowance. The seam is the actual row of stitches created when you sew. The seam allowance is the distance from that row of stitching to the edge of the fabric. If you want to sew straight line, your seam allowance is going to have to be the same distance, and you'll use the stitch plate on your sewing machine to help you sew evenly. Selvage, the tightly woven edge of fabric that runs lengthwise down the fabric. When you fold your fabric in half before you put pattern pieces on and cut, you're going to make sure those selvages touch. On most printed fabric, the selvage is this lovely white edge with words that you don't want to actually use. It gives you a nice hint at where it is. Sometimes it's just 2 rows of dots down the edge, but if you pull on this edge, it will never fray because it is tightly woven. Slip stitch. Slip stitch is a hand stitch that's almost invisible on both the right and the wrong side of your sewing project because of how it's sewn. Basically, you have 2 folds of fabric here and you're stitching back and forth so that as soon as you come out of this fold, you jump straight into that fold, and then you travel along the fold before you jump straight across. If you're jumping straight across, those 2 holes that you made with the needle will match up, and when the thread's pulled tight, it will disappear between the 2 folds of the fabric. Regulation stitch length. The optimum length each of your stitches should be is 2.5 millimeters. On your sewing machine, 2.5 shows up on the right side and you can see it easy. If you make your stitch length longer, it's easier to seam rip. If you make it smaller, it becomes near impossible to seam rip. This is the optimum length for secure stitches that are easy to undo if you make a mistake. The most common seam allowance, distance from the row of stitching to the edge of your fabric, is 5/8 of an inch. 5/8 is what you should sew at unless told otherwise by your pattern instructions. Pivoting is a way to turn a sharp corner when stitching. Basically, it's like in basketball when you pivot. You plant one of your feet and then you can spin back and forth all you'd like. To do it in sewing, you first turn the handle so the needle is down in the fabric, you plant the needle, then you can lift up your presser foot, and then turn your fabric to where you need it to be, and then don't forget to lower your presser foot again, and then you can continue sewing on your merry little way. A casing is the folded over and sewn edge of fabric that is created a tube for elastic or drawstring to be fed through. Be careful to make sure these edges will not fray or fall apart. You can serge them or fold them a second time before you sew them down. And then you can slide your elastic or drawstring through the casing. Most hoodies around the hood have a string that you can pull tight. That is a casing. Hem is the folded over and sewn edge of clothes to keep them from fraying. For example, it's the bottom of shirts, pants, sleeves, etc. You fold it twice and you sew across to keep it from falling apart. Ironing is a side-to-side motion involving heat, moisture, and pressure with the iron to smooth out wrinkles. Just back and forth just to get rid of wrinkles. Pressing is an up and down motion using heat, moisture, and pressure with the iron to purposefully crease fabric. It's best to push down firmly for about 10 seconds before you lift the iron up, move it over to your next session, and press down without sliding across the fabric. This will help you get nice folds for hems. Pressing seams open. When you sew, you connect two pieces of fabric. When you press the seams open, you're separating your seam allowance layers so you can iron them flat. If this was sewn at 5/8 of an inch, my row stitching would be right here in the center, and I have now pushed open both edges of the seam allowance, that 5/8 inch amount of fabric, so I can press it open. Raw edge, the edge of fabric that will fray and fall apart. These edges that will fall apart. Most cut edges of fabric will fray and fall apart unless you do something about it. A seam finish is a sewing technique that will prevent the raw edge from fraying. You usually only sew one layer of fabric when you create a seam finish. Options include zigzagging or serging, and there are at least 10 others. You take the edge of your seam allowance and you just zigzag right up there on the edge, only going through that single layer of the seam allowance, and then you do it with the other side. Same goes for your serging. Just be careful, you're only going through one layer instead of through the middle of your project. Notions. Notions are any item needed to sew a project other than fabric and thread. For example, buttons, elastic, cording, zippers, etc. Any of these extra items you need to complete your final project. These sewing equipment and vocabulary term pieces will help you be able to sew quality projects.